What if you found yourself face to face with a racist cop who thinks they have all the power? Well, that's exactly what happens in today's story. Meet Joda, a black woman who's had enough of being treated unfairly. When a cop stops her for a minor traffic violation, it's clear from the start that he has no intention of following the rules. But what this cop doesn't know is that Jada's about to turn the tables in a way no one expects. As the tension builds, she plays him at his own game, and the results will leave you speechless. Will the officer realize his mistake before it's too late? Or will Jada's quick thinking expose the truth? Stay tuned to find out what happens next, because what happens next will stun you. You won't believe the twist that's coming. Jada had seen it all before. The way some officers treated her as if she was less than human, the way they made assumptions based on her skin color, and the way they ignored the rules when it suited them. But today felt different. This wasn't just another routine stop. It was something bigger, a test of strength, patience, and resolve. The cop, Officer Daniels, was known for his harsh methods. He'd pulled people over for the smallest infractions, usually with no real reason other than to intimidate. His reputation in the community was far from good, and Jada knew that. As he approached her car, the tension in the air was thick. His body language said it all. He was ready to make this a confrontation. But Jada wasn't scared. She knew that if she kept her cool and played smart, she could turn the tables. The question was, how far could she push him before he cracked? As Officer Daniels approached the car, Jada's heart raced, but her hands stayed steady on the wheel. She knew exactly what he was about to do. He'd ask her questions meant to provoke a reaction, to make her look suspicious. He'd seen her before in the neighborhood, knew she was well aware of his tactics. The last time he'd stopped her, he'd made accusations that weren't even remotely true, and she hadn't forgotten it. License and registration, Daniels barked, his voice cold. He didn't smile, didn't offer any small talk, just the usual, robotic commands. Jada handed over her documents slowly, maintaining eye contact. She wasn't going to let him see her flinch. He flicked through the papers, scanning them as if looking for something to question. She could feel the weight of his stare, the way he was sizing her up, hoping for some slip-up. But Jada had been preparing for this. She had her phone ready, recording, just in case. She wasn't about to let him get away with anything this time. The officer then made an unexpected move, asking her about a neighborhood incident that had happened a few weeks ago, implying she might have been involved. Jada's gut twisted. She hadn't been anywhere near it, but this wasn't about the incident. It was about testing her, seeing how she'd respond under pressure. And Jada wasn't going to let him win. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as Daniels kept talking, trying to needle Jada into a reaction. "You know, it's not a good idea to hang around places like that," he said, his words heavy with an accusation that wasn't said outright but clearly implied. His eyes never left hers, waiting for her to break. Jada knew he was testing her patience, trying to catch her off guard, but she stood her ground. Her mind raced, analyzing every word, every shift in his tone. This was more than just a traffic stop now. This was a game of power, and Jada wasn't about to let him win. Without breaking her calm, she leaned slightly forward, keeping her voice even. "I have nothing to do with that. I've been at work all day," she said, her words precise, not a hint of fear in them. Daniels didn't flinch, but something in his eyes seemed to shift. Maybe it was the calmness in her voice, or maybe he was waiting for her to get defensive. Either way, it wasn't what he expected. For a moment, there was a strange silence, the kind that felt loaded with unspoken tension. He stepped back, as though reconsidering his next move. Jada knew the game was shifting, and she could almost feel the tension crackling in the air. Would he keep pushing? Or had he underestimated her from the start? Just then, Daniels reached for his radio, his fingers tapping on it nervously. Jada's mind raced. She knew this moment would define everything. If he called for backup, things could escalate quickly. She had to act fast. The sound of the radio crackling was the only thing that seemed to matter now. She was prepared to play her part. But would it be enough to turn the tide in her favor? The moment of truth was just around the corner. As Daniel's fingers hovered over the radio, a sudden car pulled up behind him, blocking the street. It was a black SUV, and the engine roared as it came to a halt. Jada couldn't help but notice the tense look on Daniel's face. He didn't even acknowledge the vehicle at first. His attention was still locked on her. But then, out of the corner of her eye, Jada saw a man step out of the SUV. His posture was rigid, and there was something about him that seemed off. He was wearing dark sunglasses, even though the sun had long set, and his movements were too deliberate, too controlled. Daniel stiffened. The man walked toward them, his steps slow, but there was no mistaking the authority he carried. "Is everything all right here, officer?" the man asked, his voice smooth, calm, but demanding. Jada could see the unease flicker across Daniel's face, a subtle crack in his professional mask. The officer nodded stiffly but didn't answer. Jada's instincts flared. This wasn't just about her anymore. Whoever this man was, he had a presence that made even Officer Daniels nervous. The man didn't look like a typical cop, not in the slightest. He looked like someone who had power, someone who didn't need to follow the rules, someone who might even be pulling the strings. The air grew thicker. Jada felt it. This wasn't a traffic stop anymore. It was a showdown of something much darker. Daniels seemed to hesitate, the tension between him and the stranger palpable. What was going on? Who was this man, and why was he interfering? Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized one thing. Things were about to spiral out of control, and she was caught in the middle. Would she get out of this alive, or was she about to discover just how deep the corruption really ran? The man in sunglasses stood inches away from Daniels now, his gaze locked on the officer with an intensity that made Jada's skin crawl. There was a quiet tension between them, like an unspoken understanding. Something dangerous was lurking just beneath the surface. Jada couldn't shake the feeling that this man had something to do with the way Daniels had been acting, like they were connected in some way. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Jada and the stranger. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might say something, but the words got caught in his throat. The man smirked, clearly sensing the officer's hesitation. "You know," he said, his voice low but carrying an eerie sense of power, "it's not a good look when a cop is caught in a lie, especially when there's evidence to back it up." The tension exploded in Jada's mind. Evidence? What was he talking about? The stranger pulled out a small device from his jacket, showing it to Daniels. It was a body cam, but not just any body cam. This one was tied to a hidden camera Jada had set up in her car hours before. She hadn't been sure if she'd need it, but now it was clear. Daniels had been recorded, and Jada had the proof. The officer's face went pale as he realized his mistake. He had no idea she'd been recording the entire interaction. Jada didn't hesitate. "You've been caught, Officer Daniels," she said, her voice steady but firm. "You've been targeting people like me for far too long, thinking you could get away with it." The stranger looked at Jada, his eyes filled with approval, before turning back to Daniels. "This isn't just about her, is it? You've been making a habit of this, haven't you? It's time to stop covering for him." Daniels went rigid, his hand slowly moving towards his gun. But before he could make a move, the man in sunglasses was already on him, pinning him to the ground with a swift, practiced motion. Jada's mind was racing. The man wasn't a cop, and it wasn't about power. This was about justice. Daniels had been caught in his own lies, and now the truth was finally coming to light. But as the man stood over the officer, ready to make sure he faced the consequences, he turned toward Jada with a final chilling smile. "You've done well," the man said, his voice soft, but there was something dangerous lurking in it. "But don't think this is over. People like us, we don't just walk away. There's always more at play." As he disappeared into the night, Jada was left with the overwhelming sense that this was only the beginning. Officer Daniels was caught, but the world she had stepped into was far deeper and darker than she could have imagined. The next few days were a whirlwind. Officer Daniels was arrested, And the footage Jada had captured became the key piece of evidence that exposed his corruption. News outlets picked up the story, and the community, finally aware of what had been happening, rallied behind her. It felt like a small victory, but Jada knew it was just the tip of the iceberg. Despite the satisfaction of seeing Daniels face the consequences of his actions, the mysterious man in sunglasses haunted her thoughts. Who was he, and what was his role in all of this? She would never have the answers to those questions, but one thing was clear. Jada had become part of something much bigger than herself. The fight wasn't over, and she had learned that standing up for what's right, no matter the odds, was the only way forward. As she looked out over the city, Jada realized she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was starting to change the game. Despite the satisfaction of seeing Daniels face the consequences of his actions, the mysterious man in sunglasses haunted her thoughts. Who was he, and what was his role in all of this? She would never have the answers to those questions, but one thing was clear. Jada had become part of something much bigger than herself. The fight wasn't over, and she had learned that standing up for what's right, no matter the odds, was the only way forward. As she looked out over the city, Jada realized she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was starting to change the game.